begin with our notes. I do need to make sure when you leave today that you grab the cheat sheet. The cheat sheet is Road to Revolution, and then back in the back, don't get it now, but back in the back is the templates for the one-pager. This time you can choose whichever one you want. There's a lot back there. And the one-pager is Revolutionary War. And again, I did not change the assignment, so those of you still asking me about quotes, there are no quotes. So just at the top, in whichever one you're using, just write Revolutionary War, and then just move all the way through that. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so we are on page 6 and 7. Stop me at 9 o'clock because we do have our last quiz, our first quiz today. So we finish with the Stamp Act Congress, the idea that our first reaction to these new taxes is some kind of legislative response. And that, again, comes as a result of that salutary neglect, us being able to establish House of Burgesses, town hall meetings, councils, representatives, and that's how we address this first problem. And it's important to note, the very first problem that we have, we address legislatively, and we come up with real concrete things. We're going to send a list of things that we don't like about this guy. We're going to boycott buying British goods. We're going to try to hurt them economically. At the same time, this other group of people called the Sons of Liberty, headed by Sam Adams, will compete with this line of attack violently. Thank you, Rocco. Violently. And his agreements, or the way that the Sons of Liberty address the non-importation, is that when people do buy things that are British, they are targeted. They are tar and feathered. And again, it doesn't seem like that's a really big thing, but tarring and feathering is a fairly torturous and dangerous, and oftentimes leads to death, because for tar to be able to pour, it has to be what? Hot. It scalds people. So this becomes a normalized response for these Sons of Liberty to incite violence on individual targeted people, officials, and buildings that represent officials. Houses of pro-British the officials will be vandalized. They will steal things. They will burn things. And Stamp Act agents were forced to resign because no one wanted to go out and actually come up against these Sons of Liberties. Again, they are a group of people with violent means of protest, and that will be again what will happen as a result. As a result of these two things, and please know that it's both of these things, not one more than the other, the Stamp Act is repealed in 1766. So the colonists were successful in their first attempt to push back against what they perceived as unfair taxes. That Stamp Act was put out. Again, both of these groups obviously want to take the credit, but really it is both of those. The legislative movement and this violent group of people together bring about the end of the Stamp Act. So Lord Rockingham saw the Stamp Act as a possible cause of civil crisis and encouraged the British merchants to write Parliament to rescind the tax. Rescind means to take away. So Parliament passed the Declaratory Act at the same time, and the purpose was to save face. And what they said was exactly this. This time, we're going to take it back, but we reserve the right to tax you in any future businesses or any future time period. So the Declaratory Act said, all right, we're going to take it back, but we don't want you to think you won anything, right? We can always come back and tax you, which they will do shortly thereafter. The Townshend Acts come when Mr. Townshend takes control of Parliament. And the Townshend Acts, the colonists react against that because, as you see in number 1, it is an act to punish the colonies. So for the colonists, they reacted in a way, and not that would not have happened in Great Britain, violent protests, because it did, but they reacted, Parliament rescinded, and you're now going to punish us because you rescinded the act. And so these provisions get even harsher than the Stamp Act because, again, they're intended to punish. Small duty placed on glass, white lead, paper, paint, silk, tea. So that's everything. The Stamp Act was paper. This now includes glass, white lead, paper, paint, silk, and tea. The tax was an indirect customs duty. That means there is absolutely no way that you can get around in a regular daily life without using something that had to be taxed. This part of the provision also enraged the colonists because the taxes from this, because the British were trying to say, okay, now we're not taking the taxes back to Great Britain. They're going to stay in the colonies, but they're going to be used to pay royal governors and judges. So the Crown heard what the colonists said. You're taxing us and taking our tax dollars back to Britain. We don't have representation. So this time the Townshend Act said, we're going to tax you and the tax dollars will stay in the colonies. But the colonists said, to do what? To pay people supporting or working for the British Crown. Establish a commission and a vice admiralty courts for enforcement, and the judges would allowed to be write writs of assistance. And again, those are search warrants. That's what that writs of assistance is. It's a search warrant in private homes, shops, or warehouses. That is one of the reasons, again, in our Bill of Rights, that it is so imperative, this idea of a search warrant, and that search warrants are just this holy grail of all things that protect us. So for instance, who do we want to have in our class right now? If we were to say somebody might have dead bodies in their basement, who would it most like? Oh, Nora. Everyone is automatically pointing Nora and Scott. Scott, you want the dead bodies? Okay, Scott, you might question your friends there, Nora, because I didn't even get all the words out and like 4 people were pointing at you. But we'll make it Scott. We'll make it Scott this time. Nora, you can be the next person. All right. Scott, the police think because there's so many people in and out of Scott's house, the first thought is he is in drug trafficking. So we get a search warrant to search his house for drugs. And we go down into the basement. Instead of seeing drugs, we find bodies. Our search warrant only says we're allowed to look for drugs. We cannot do anything or arrest Scott for those bodies because we found them in a search warrant that was not for drugs. Now, what will happen is we'll call on the phone and say, we got a whole bunch of dead bodies. Judge, we need a search warrant for these dead bodies. But until we get that second search warrant for bodies, we can't do anything about it. You always, and I would never, ever advise this to you to do because it will now take up 5 hours of your time. But if you're ever stopped by the police and they ask if they can search your car, you have the constitutional right to say, no, you may not search my car. Now what's going to happen is they're going to pull you over. They're going to call a judge and wait. You have to wait for them to get the right to search your car. So that's why I never suggest that you do that. But you have the right to say no. You have the right to say, no, you may not search my car. Imagine how mad they'd be if you said no and they didn't find correct. I would never advise that to you, but that is your constitutional right. So again, one of our assignments as we move into the new nation, You're going to get those Bill of Rights, and you're going to have to connect each one of those 10 amendments back to one of these events that occurs during the Revolutionary War, because all 10 of those actually, well, you can do all 10. All 10 of them, let's just say all 6 of them, the first 6 have a direct correlation between what's happening in this time period and those Bill of Rights. So obviously you can see our colonial reaction is going to be intensified by this response. And we start again because, and this is why we spent so much time in our last chapter talking about enlightenment, deist, intellectualism. We respond with this first group by writing stuff down. And John Dickinson's going to be our first guy. And these things are pamphlets that have these awesome, impressive names like Letter from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, right? This is a guy who's coming across as saying, look, I'm just a farmer in Pennsylvania. Here's my problem. This is already, as the colonist, taking the stance of the all American, all colonist kind of dude. I'm just a farmer in Pennsylvania. What do I know? Kind of attitude. But he challenges this idea of what this means to the colonists. And again, under B, the crown should be denied the right to levy taxes for the purpose of revenue. That is not what collecting taxes is about. You have to come up with some other way to earn revenue. And what this gives us is this Massachusetts circular letter. And Massachusetts circular letter, the Massachusetts legislature, urged by Sam Adams and James Otis to support Dickinson's arguments and called for other colonies to pass petitions calling for Parliament to repeal the Townshend Acts. So again, and the reason the Massachusetts circular letters are so important is this is the first time we talk to all other 12 colonies. This is really something that needs to be addressed by all of us, not just particular groups, because Massachusetts and Pennsylvania will be the 2 guiding colonies in this process. In response, Britain will send troops to Boston and threaten to dissolve Massachusetts legislature. Other colonies reenacted previous non-importation agreements. British exports fall 40%. So at this point, that boycott is starting to be successful. The boycott is starting to show signs of success. 40%, that's a tremendous drop. And several colonial legislators dissolved as they supported Massachusetts. Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, South Carolina. So for the next couple of things, all of these things are going to be focused in Massachusetts. And again, it is important to note, how do we get what's happening in Massachusetts, and in particular what's happening in Boston, spread throughout these colonies, rest of the colonies. On page 7, we have our Boston massacre. And again, massacre is in quotations because only 5 people are going to die. And any loss of life is horrible, but that hardly constitutes a massacre. The use of massacre becomes propaganda. It becomes propaganda in the hands of the patriots. And when we step through this Boston massacre, again, we will see what happens as a result of this increase of troops in Boston. So peaceful arrival of troops. Colonists are fearful of standing armies. We hate standing armies, and we are going to do this time and time again. Every time, even up until World War II, right before we go to war, we are never, ever, ever prepared for war. Ever, ever. Because we don't like standing armies. And we don't like standing armies because of 1773, when all of these troops start rolling into Boston. We don't like it. So March 3rd, 1770, British soldiers, having been provoked, fired on a squad. So here's what happens. The British are guarding one of their garrisons. They're just standing in front. A crowd of people come up. They start throwing snowballs. In these snowballs, quite often, as what happens with snowball fights, they start with just regular snowballs, and then people start putting rocks in the snowballs, and then people started putting bricks in the snowballs. And so these British officers feel threatened. And here is why standing armies in towns and cities are so dangerous. Because militaries are trained to respond militarily. That's how they're trained. We're going to see the same thing in 1970s when the Ohio militia is called into Kent State University to stand in front of a peaceful protest of students. And when they're threatened, they shoot and they kill 4 students, 4 unarmed students. The same thing's going to happen in the Boston Massacre. And it's not a place where you can put blame, because the soldiers were doing what they were trained to do. That's what we're trained to do. When we feel threatened, that's what we train to do. And so that's what they do. They shoot. And they will kill 11 citizens killed or wounded. Our first African-American killed in this march toward war is Crispus Attucks, and that's why you see a whole lot of high schools in and around Boston, Massachusetts, New England, urban areas named Crispus Attucks. I think Indianapolis has a high school named Crispus Attucks. Word of this massacre is going to spread. This becomes propaganda. This becomes the use of the colonists to talk to those other 10 colonies that don't have any problem with the crown. Look what your British Army just did. And what happens, before we turn the page, what happens, let's just draw a line at the bottom, to those men is that they are defended by the second president of the United States, John Adams. Because what John Adams says is these men have a right to a fair trial. That's what we're about. We're not about what the crown would do is give these people a trial without a judge and a jury. This is what we stand for, even though we don't have a country yet. John Adams is already enforcing this idea that everyone is equal under the eyes of the law and has a right to a trial. So John Adams, under great risk of his reputation, defends these British soldiers, and they the regular line soldiers get dismissed because they were following orders, and the officer gets charged with manslaughter, and I think it's 10 years. I'm not sure about that part. But the important part for us is John Adams already, before we are a country, is standing up for the principles that will become the foundation, that everyone is equal under the eyes of the law. And while we might not like what those British troops did, they have a right to a fair trial. And he represents them. I shouldn't say he defends them. That's not a good word. He represents them as their counselor in a court of law. On the top of page 8, because of these things, the Townshend Acts are repealed. And as they are repealed, Lord North, bowing to pressure, gets Parliament to repeal it in 1770. And I think this is probably part of the Revolutionary War story that gets left out quite often in telling in elementary and junior high, that the colonists are successful. So far, we are 2 for 2. We didn't like the Stamp Act, repealed the Stamp Act. We didn't like the Townshend Acts, we got the Townshend Acts repealed. And so we have to figure out, while we are being successful at all these things, why when we get to 1776, we're ready to throw in the towel and say, we don't want to work with you anymore. Because at this point, we, colonists, are winning. We're 2 for 2. Colonists, as my back people say, the crown is taking the L. They're losing every single time. So half the troops in Boston are removed, and until 1773, relations improved. So for 3 years, we're good. No problem. None at all. The Gaspee incident, only a few incidents between, but one of this is a British warship runs aground. They kind of come up, burn it, take it over. The bottom of page 8, the committees of correspondence. This is Sam Adams again. Sam Adams is a great agitator. He is an important part of the Revolutionary War as this revolutionary. He is a true revolutionary. Please make sure you note when we get to the new nation who is not included at any point. Sam Adams. He is not part of the new nation. Why? Because George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, all of those people recognize we can't have that dude. We cannot have that dude. That dude's response to everything is violence, and we can't have that. So it's very important to note that while these revolutionaries, these true revolutionaries, let's burn things, let's hang people, let's tar and feather people, were really important part of this Revolutionary War, they will not be a part of the new nation. They will on purpose be excluded for their strong beliefs in violent response to things, because that's Sam Adams' response to everything, is always some kind of violence. So he organized these committees of correspondence, and their idea, what they're supposed to do, 8B, spread propaganda. Is propaganda always true? No, it's usually a distortion of the truth. You usually can find a nugget of truth in that propaganda, but its aim is to change people's opinions. In particular, what he's looking for is letters from the British government, including those of Governor Hutchinson that showed what the British was acting on Hutchinson's advice. And this intercolonial groups directly leads to the first American Congress. All right. We need to finish this before we take our quiz. All right, we'll take our quiz on Monday, people, because we do need to finish these notes. All right. Questions, anybody? Make sure you have your videos ready to turn in on Monday. We'll be looking at those on Tuesday as we move into war. Anybody have questions about those? The videos are, yes. The videos are not due with the homework. The videos are due on Monday. That is something that has a good, strong due date, people.